So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure we could use for project work. The advantages of structure are, first of all, that you can break down a potentially rather forbidding task into a series of manageable subtasks. So most students, when they hear the mention of 6,000 or 7,000 words worth of project, go a little bit pale. But if you say to them, well, don't worry, over the next 5 weeks, we're going to produce 2,000 words of research for a literature review, that's a more manageable prospect. I've put here a structure that would work for a dissertation or an investigation project. So this follows the template of a standard university-style academic research project with an abstract, an introduction, a literature review, a discussion, a conclusion, and an evaluation. I should add as well that if the students are doing an investigation, then probably at this point here, after the literature review, we would put in methodology, and the discussion would be primarily in the form of data that has been collected being analysed. So factor in here some methodology, some data collection, and some analysis. But at sort of headline level, that's a reasonable framework to use. The advantages of, as I've said, is it makes the task more manageable. Another advantage is that you can gently guide the students as to what's appropriate at each stage. So, for example, in a literature review, we'd expect them to be reviewing the available sources, the literature that relates to their question, and they should be doing that in a fairly neutral, objective, scholarly fashion, not necessarily disclosing their own thoughts at that stage. Whereas in a discussion, we'd expect them to actually get stuck into the argument, to be putting their point of view, to be backing it up with evidence from their sources, and to be considering and responding to counter-arguments. And one of the reasons, another of the reasons, as well as the advantage of making the process more manageable, another of the reasons that I like this approach is that if you don't do this, what I find students tend to do is essentially they conflate a dissertation with an essay. So they will produce material which is rather mixed up in terms of the flow of ideas, looking at other people's ideas, putting in their own thoughts, not necessarily really getting to grips with the research literature and then responding in an argumentative way. Or another problem is that if you don't emphasize the importance of having both a literature review and a discussion, students will tend to do their projects in a purely descriptive way, putting points from the sources all the way through the project and only giving their own ideas by the time they get to the conclusion, by which stage it's a little bit too late to engage in the argument. So I encourage them to work to this structure because it gives them the discipline of learning to engage with the scholarly sources, learning to engage with the literature first, and then responding to it by actually getting involved in the argument, putting their own points, trying to back them up from sources. All this said, I don't think this is mandatory, and there are cases where this structure doesn't work well. The most obvious example of that would be if they're doing an historical or literary project, where in essence the consideration of sources goes hand in hand with the argumentative analysis. And in that case, a structure based on chapters would be more natural, and that could work perfectly well. And if a student's doing that, all I say to them is just make sure that within each chapter you do both the review of sources and the discussion, so that in both cases there's some consideration of what other people have said and some exploration of their own point of view. Other points about that structure, just briefly, although it's laid out in a particular order, it's advisable to tell students that they don't necessarily need to try and write the abstract or introduction at the beginning. That the best place to begin with is usually the literature review, and that once they've done that, they can then move on to a discussion, and only at that stage begin to think about writing an introduction and then topping and tailing with conclusions and abstract. The other point to remind students about, because it's easily forgotten, is the evaluation. That's the part of the project where they review how it's gone. The focus shifts from the topic to the actual project process, and they'll be considering questions such as, what have they done well? Did they really meet their aims? What are the limitations of their project? And what would they do differently if they were beginning the project again? and also what lessons can they take away from EPQ. So evaluation is much more personal, much more subjective, and much more a reflection on the process rather than on the topic. If they're doing a performance or an artifact or a practical piece of work, then a similar structure can be used, but the focus is more on technical visual analysis, analysis of material that will actually feed into the developmental process. So in place of a literature review, I would probably speak about a research review. And within that, I'd expect them to cover areas such as the genre. If they're doing a film, look at the genre of film, look at, for example, documentary filmmaking, what's involved in that process, get some general sense of what it's all about before they dive into their particular piece of work. Influences, who can they learn from, what's out there, what pieces of work can they access that they can pick up tips and inspiration from. Reviews as well of pieces of work can be useful. Materials, that doesn't necessarily mean the concrete materials that they're using. It could mean the ideas that are going to inform their project, particularly if they're doing artistic or filmmaking work. The thinking behind the project is just as important as the actual choice of medium and materials in a physical sense. Processes and techniques, have they explored a range of different approaches that they could use? Have they researched to find out what will actually enable them to achieve their creative intentions? And following research, there needs to be a process of development. And as with an academic discussion, it's important that this is argumentative, that it involves deliberation, debate, considering alternative ways in which a project could unfold. It's quite common with practical projects for students to go for something that they're quite good at already. They can already play the music, they can already sing the song or do the artwork. And we really want to see them exploring, experimenting, extending themselves into new areas. So trying alternative possible developmental routes, experimenting with them, evaluating whether they lead to a better outcome. That discursive, argumentative process is just as important in the practical units as it is with the written projects. And that could be manifest in a sort of developmental essay in which they comment on how they came to their final outcome. Or it could be obvious through their sketchbook or through Google Slides, PowerPoint slides, where they're just putting down alternatives, evaluating them as they go, showing that thought process that leads to a rich and interesting project outcome. And again, we'd expect to see a review for a performance or practical project, and that really should involve ideally feedback from audience or end users or people who've encountered their work in an exhibition, some sense that they've reflected on whether or not their project has achieved its creative intentions in terms of its impact on its end users. So those structures are, I think, helpful for almost all students, helpful for you in guiding them through the process, giving them little pointers at each stage, helpful in breaking down the requirements, the project into manageable subtasks, and helping them to meet the requirements of a good project at each different stage.